enjoy Gdansk today, even in the rain. Well, it's a jewel of a town, particularly when you consider it was where World War II started with the bombardment of the city by the German Navy, and then it got ravaged through the war. And so what we see is like a recreated phoenix of the past of Poland. And today I'm going to give you an introduction to the next ports of Klaipeda and Riga and Tallinn, and some historical background just for your interest. Because this has been a very contested part of the world, to say the least. And I've been coming here for much of my life at sea. I actually studied Russian in college, and then I remember was working in Sweden. I came to Finland, tried to go to Russia, but as soon as I uttered any Russian, they said, "You can't come here." Oh well, back in the bad old days, which have now returned. And so I've been here quite a bit of times, but we're at kind of a cusp of history. What they call in German the Zweitewende, the turning of history again. And hopefully it will be a peaceful one, but there's a lot of trouble in the air, which I'll talk about a bit. This actually Riga here, the waterfronted Riga, where we will be all of tomorrow morning. But here we are in the Baltic, which if you saw my recorded presentation about the Bornholm and Gdansk, the Baltic Sea was in recent times a freshwater lake. During the Ice Age, much of Scandinavia in the north was covered by ice, and as the temperature went up and climate changed 15,000 years ago, eventually the opening to the North Sea rose enough to go over the sand dunes of Denmark and then fill the Baltic Sea with salt water. But it is about 1/10 the saltiness of the North Atlantic, just because it has all these rivers. It drains a very large landmass. And today it's sort of characterized by all these little islands in Sweden and Latvia and Finland. So it's sort of a maze of places which were traditionally isolated from each other. And then all of the shores were contested by the neighbors on either side of the lake. So now we know it, of course, as the nations where we've been: Denmark and Poland, and we're going to Lithuania tomorrow, and Riga, and then to Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and then to Stockholm, Sweden. But I came across a quote of the former Estonian Prime Minister, who was Lennart Meri, who said, "The past becomes the present, and history becomes politics, and politics is a factory which produces the future." So unfortunately, this part of the world is burdened by its turbulent history, going back even to prehistoric times, the Vikings invading Russia, and the Germans taking into Denmark, and all the conflicts. So I just listed a kind of a short, if terrible, list of all the troubles, where the Russians fought the Swedish and the British attacked Denmark. You just sort of read it down, one attack and one squabble, and going up to the modern times of World War II. It reminds me of the song is, you don't like me, I don't like you, and I don't like anybody very much. But in the modern world, we have a global economy and a tender survival of many systems. So this sort of old-time warfare, we would hope, would be obsolete. But the Polish writer Czesław Milosevic wrote, "It's possible that there is no memory but the memory of wounds." And so all our good times are often forgotten in our daily life of normal things, but we remember the last conflicts, and especially the wars. And I'm always impressed when I go to parts of the world and they speak of conflicts that go back hundreds of years, always in the present tense. And the soil is soaked in blood that must demand revenge, which is a terrible human trait. Well, anyway, I'm going to just go on to show you a little bit about our ports. This is the seal of Lithuania. With Latvia and Estonia, they are small countries that have been recently made independent yet again, but they have long traditions linguistically in their literature, and Lithuania is one of them. The three Baltic nations, who have various times been parts of larger empires, but they've kept their identity, which is quite remarkable. And another writer in Estonia, Uku Mitsings, wrote, the smaller peoples have a broader horizon precisely because they cannot get past the existence of the larger ones being the dominating forces in their area. Well, Lithuania is on the eastern shores of the Baltic, and it has a certain amount of hill country. It has a lot of lowlands and plains like this, which were forested and then farmed, and so, but this is sort of a corridor where people would migrate in ancient times. Now it's a modern nation with a number of different provinces, and will be in Klaipeda and on the shores of the Baltic Sea. The capital is down in Vilnius, which is not far from Minsk, Belarus, and it's also not that far from Moscow. So this country has been variously taken between the Swedish, the German, the Russian Empire, but it has been independent for the last 2 decades, which is a long stretch considering all the history that it was under the rule of another outside power. But this is what it looks like on the Baltic shore, where some of you may go out to see the sand lands, and these have very big sand dunes facing the Baltic. And that's where the amber comes from, because the lake that was flooded had been a deep pine old-growth forest, and in the flooding of the Baltic Sea, that kind of broke down and then became these nuggets of pine resin that became amber, which are now the Baltic gold. And that was a major trade item into prehistory. They found amber in the Middle East, for instance, and it was traded for gold and furs and various things. And it's still a commodity you'll see on the street. But this is what Lithuania looks like. A lot of lowlands, little hills, swamplands. Some of it's very intensively agricultural, but a lot of it is still the original pine forest like this. And it also has a lot of nature reserves, so it has the largest aviary protection program in this area. It's in a flyway going up to Finland and down to Africa. So these are storks that migrate every year. In the human history, there were fortified hamlets that were surrounded by stockades and built up as a sort of your house would be placed on a hill so you could see where you, if any trouble was coming, and you'd be above any floodwaters. And this is one of the preserved houses in one of the museums in Vilnius. So this was rather rudimentary living, but it was full of folklore and life. And the Lithuanian heritage speaks of kings that lived underground, and they had underground palaces because it was safer to live underground. And then they would come up and fight with the bears. And there's some national sagas to this which are recited in Lithuanian and are sort of the core origin myth for their people, and they're celebrated in dance and song regularly. And so the language is what carries these smaller minority cultures forward. And now, since they were freed from the Soviet Union, they have instituted language training. They've rebuilt their libraries. For instance, when Stalin came in and retook the Baltic countries, he ordered the destruction of all the libraries with all the literature, replaced by Russian, in a real sort of the brutal cultural imperialism of the time. Now they're having a flowering of it, and they say as long as the youth learn the language, the culture will survive. Lithuania used to be a much bigger place in the sense of it was allied with other noble families and local leaders to stretch all the way down, including Kiev and down to Odessa and the Black Sea. Now this is in the 1400s, so that was a great distance at the time. And so in Lithuania, what is now the borders of Lithuania, there are castles and evidence of the sort of the glory time of Lithuania as a ruler over, including much of Poland, much of Ukraine and such. And so it became a fairly wealthy country in the Middle Ages just by the trade connections between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Baltic. So Vilnius, the capital, was built up with some elaborate palaces, and it was a showcase for their culture. And of course, because they were surrounded by, let's say, people who didn't agree, they kept getting invaded and having every century a whole other battle of either independence or changing the borders, or allies with particularly the Poles against the Russians. And so this woman, Emilia Plater, became a leader of a revolt against the Russians. In 1831, she was a leader of a peasant and militia army that then tried to free Lithuania from the Tsarist rule. She was an excellent horsewoman and a marksman, so she led her troops into battle, and she became what may be called sort of the Joan of Arc of Lithuanian culture, because she was injured in battle and died, and the revolt failed, but she's always referred to as one of the great patriots of the country. And then there were more uprisings, particularly when the Bolsheviks took St. Petersburg and Moscow, and Vladimir Lenin urged the Baltic states to become independent again and not have the Tsarist yoke anymore and liberate the nation that way. Well, this led to, let's say, more battles, and there was in 1918 an independence of all the Baltic states, which then was cut short by Stalin and the Russian army in 1939. But this had many a martyr and many a casualty, of course, and so outside of Vilnius, the highest point in the country is covered with memorial crosses called the Hill of Crosses. Then later, as the Soviet Union began to be overextended, the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians started to protest. They wanted their independence back, and they had what they call the Soviet Socialist Republic of each country that in turn voted to be independent of the federal Soviet system. And so they declared their independence, and in a remarkable event, they began singing their national songs and then lining up on the roads all the way from the shores of Estonia all the way down to the Polish border in Lithuania. And this sort of stumped the Russians. They didn't know what to do with tens of thousands of people singing for days and days and days, and finally there was a nonviolent dissolution of the Russian occupation, because there were many military bases here. Above all, Estonia alone had 500 Russian bases just along its small territory, and the Baltic peoples, they demanded that they be shut down and moved back and given territory back to their own administration. There is still remnant and large Russian population in various towns, especially in Estonia. So this has been one of the problems, is you restore the independence of these small countries, you bring back their language. Now if you're in Lithuania, if you don't learn Lithuanian, you'll be ineligible to be a citizen. So there's a bit of discrimination against the Russians that are there, and many of them are bilingual. This is typical in all around Europe, but Lithuania proudly joined the EU and uses the euro, and has modernized, and the standard of living has quadrupled in the Baltic states since the 1980s. So with trade with the EU and support, now these Baltic states are proudly part of NATO. And so this is the strategic situation now. And here's the NATO conference being held in Vilnius in 2023. But I'll go on just to show you where we're going. This is Klaipeda, which is the port town, and not a very big city, but it's on the shore of the Baltic, so we come in through the breakwater. In my reading, I said, well, all these towns have a breakwater out since early times, because the Baltic seems very calm right now, but in the winter it's let's say a pounding surf, particularly on the eastern side as the winds come from the northwest. And the old days before mechanization, the people would roll big rocks out onto the frozen shores of the Baltic, and then when the spring came and the water thawed, then they would slowly build a breakwater like this out to protect their little harbor. Now, of course, it's done with big machines now, but it's a river that comes into Klaipeda and has some shipping, and this is the only port for Lithuania of any size, so it has container shipping and industry as we go in, and then come in and dock in the center of the town. So it is not a very big place, but it's a walkable town, so you can go around. There are a number of excursions and home visits, and there's visit to an apiary and different things that are offered as an excursion, but mostly you can just walk around and see the town, and it seems to have water everywhere, canals, fountains, boats, even boats made out of flowers. And neighborhoods, a lot of this was destroyed during the war, so this is not quite like Gdansk, where they made the renewed medieval town. It is mostly modern style, low-rise housing with some new building. Not quite as industrious or big as the capital, Vilnius, but it has its university and its shorelines and fountains, particularly a lot of fountains with boats in them. So we'll be there just for tomorrow and see what we can see. Hopefully the weather will be better. But there are shops, and it's a fairly relaxed town because it's not a big industrial center. It's more educational and then transportation with some of the symbology of the Lithuanian past. This church is outside the center of town, but I was reading about it, and it has been recently, I'd say, ecclesiastically divorced from the bishopry of the Orthodox Russian Church in Moscow, which has been a main backer, calling the war on Ukraine the righteous redemption of whatever you want to call it. So that's created a split in the religious communities, and this is now independent of the Russian authorities. And they've restored some of their libraries and museums to their culture. This is a monument to a poet in the 1600s. And I found that they surrounded it recently with mirrors and this kind of sculptural so that you could look to the past but look to the future and see a better way forward, particularly as an independent country. But I'll show you just the shore a bit, because some of you are taking that perhaps an excursion out to the spit of sand that makes a lagoon and has tranquil waters on one side and then the Baltic on the outside of the sand in the lagoon. But it's littered with shipwrecks because of the wars, and they have left some of them as just a monument to remind people of the trouble of the past. These were actually built by the German army to defend against attack from the sea, and now they're just covered with memorials and such. But one of the problems is that the Baltic Sea had so many ships sunk in it and munitions dumped in it, even nuclear waste in recent times, so that this is a reminder of the impact of war on the ecology. And so they keep trying to defuse bombs. They find mines in the bottom of the sea near the entrance to the harbor. And so it may look tranquil now, but it's actually has a problem of serious industrial pollution into the waters. But then we'll move on to Latvia and up into the Bay of Riga, and this is Estonia's up here. And this is, again, pretty much flat land, agricultural, and the city of Riga is both the capital and the major city, and they have about 500,000 people in the local area. Again, these countries have 2 to 3 million inhabitants each. But Riga was, again, had a lot of damage and has been rebuilt. And now it's a fairly modern city with transportation, a lot of business going on there, transport. On the shore near where we will land, they have this curious statue of who was called Big Christopher, who was a big man whose job was to put people on his back and swim across the river before there were any bridges and maybe even any boats. And so one day he heard a baby crying on the shore, and he put it on its back and swam across to the Riga side of the river. But as he went along, the baby kept getting heavier and heavier, and he didn't know why it was. He barely made it, and he put the baby in a little house. And then when he came to check on the baby had turned into a big bag of gold. How about that for modern Planned Parenthood? Except that was the mythical founding of the city, and his statue is just down the waterfront from where we'll dock. So this is a city that goes back to the 1226 as a trading center, but it was mostly run by Germans, who were called the Livonian Germans, who had come from Danzig, Gdansk now, or Hamburg, and part of the Hanseatic trade routes in the Baltic. And so then they built a fortified city and put up the towers that still exist. And it was proudly a very prosperous place. Again, trading with all the other cities of the Hansa League all the way to Bruges in Belgium and London and in the UK. But again, it had to be fortified with this kind of star fortifications, some of which are still there, but mostly it's been developed into a big urban center. So we'll land here at the Riga waterfront, which is built a lot of it on landfill and made a very beautiful big park and a lot of events there. There's there was a big festival going on there last week in the summertime of everybody out enjoying themselves. But the centerpiece for the city is the old castle. And this dates from the 13th century. It's now the seat of the executive of the Latvian government. And it's been preserved and, let's say, gotten fancy. That's our dock right there. So you can walk off the ship and into the old town. There'll be a shuttle bus right to the main square if you don't want to take the longer walk. We took the bus in and walked back to the ship, so it's pretty convenient. And in the main square, they have these incredible ornate store fronts. Actually, one's a church, another was a customs house, and the city hall nearby. So the town has a very elegant and formalistic look to it. Central Bank of Latvia, that's the flag of the nation up there on top. More parks, and it's pretty well spread out, and has trams in a very busy urban center. The opera house, things like this. But it over time, it developed a lot of its own sort of characteristic, elaborate, almost Art Deco or Jugendstil decorations on some of the buildings. So it's quite a treat for the eye just to walk around the center town just to see how people elevated themselves through this sort of decoration on their houses, not the glass boxes that we build these days. And so this is part of the charm of the city. It considered itself a center for arts and culture, music. They say the most famous of the artists all moved away, but the town was sort of the birth of many styles and creative minds. And so a lot of it's been preserved in either museums or house tours and such. So I found a couple of pictures of some of the artists, a poet from the earlier century, a painter, Vera Muchina, and so it was a European capital of culture back in the previous centuries and has returned to that status at times. And it was a very elegant and prosperous city until the war came, and it was again invaded and reinvaded. Let's say the Russian army came back in and bombarded mercilessly, and this is what the town square looked like back then, 1945, as the Soviet armies came in, and then amazingly it's been rebuilt. That's the exact same scene today. So it's a very great, like Gdansk, kind of a revival of the past for the future. But because of the turmoil of the Soviet Union and also their heavy-handed, let's say, deculturalization of the local people, there was blockades and strikes, and then the singing revolution and such meant that Riga and Latvia were also, in 1990, they voted for their independence, and under Gorbachev they were granted that, and along with the other Soviets that decided not to be part of the Russian Federation. So again, it has prospered, and there's a lot of new construction, particularly a lot of IT and computerized work and financial trading and such. But most strikingly, across the river from where we are docked, there is the new National Library, which after the destruction of the old libraries by the Tsar and then the Soviet Russians, they're most proud of this new library, because people would actually take their personal home libraries and they would bury them in their gardens. So they called, when they were going to build the National Library again, they keep finding box after box in people's backyard, kind of restoring the national language and pride of the nation. But in the meanwhile, in Riga, in the center square, there had been a monument built to the heroes of the Great Patriotic Wars, it's called in Russian. So this tower is about 85 meters, 280 feet high, but the new Latvian government and the local people voted, and the mayor initiated a replacement of that tower. They took it down, carted it off, and put up another one, the Freedom Tower now. So this is not unlike some other countries that are going through a little historical redress of grievances and then rebuilding of a different narrative for the past. So here's the top and the symbol of the country and Lithuania. So I'll just show you a few more street scenes, because in the small downtown, the old city, either the buildings are preserved or they've been rebuilt, but particularly you'll see a lot of Ukrainian flags because all the Baltic countries watch what's going on now, worrying that they may be next, as it has been publicly proclaimed by some Russian advocates that these nations should be a province of the Russian Federation and they shouldn't object to the war, such as it is. But meanwhile, it's a very peaceful place. These are actually amber necklaces that are being sold. And curiously, to the right, the Marioshka, babushka kind of dolls that are made in Russia. So it's close and should be friendly, let's say, but you can almost feel the tension in the air even on a warm, sunny day. So my grandson Pemba here, hello Pemba, and I were hiking around, and he said, oh, we found a cart we can go ride around on, one of these self-propelled carts, except you notice it has a barrel of beer, and it has a tap, and you have to bicycle with everybody to get the pump working so that you can serve beer. Now, that's my kind of exercise machine. But Riga is, spreads out into a network in a lot of outside towns and villages, and you'll see trams on the street. And so this is a matter of some political problem because all the trains and highways generally went east to west into Russia, or Belarus in this case, right on the border here, rather than there being transportation going from Estonia to Latvia to Lithuania. And so this has led a project by the EU to put up a new rail line from Tallinn, where we'll be going in a couple of days, down to Riga, and then down to Vilnius and Lithuania. And so this is called the Rail Baltica. And this is a major investment, mostly paid by the EU transportation funding to unite these small nations so that they will be more integrated. And particularly they unplug from the Russian electric grid, and they've been laying cables from Sweden over to each country so that they are on the Nordic power grid. And so this is, say, infrastructure as a geopolitical intent. And here's the construction through the countryside from Lithuania up. And the critical difference is that the European rail is a little wider than the Russian rail. So the Russian cars and transport cannot go on this new north-south rail, but the new rail will accommodate the EU train carriers if it comes to that. So this is the problem here now, because if you follow the news, you remember the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia coming down to the shore of Baltic Germany was sabotaged and created this terrible scene out in the ocean where there was 500,000 cubic meters of methane natural gas was spewing out of the ocean, and it was spotted, and finally they could turn it off. But the cause of this has been under investigation. Finally, they issued a warrant for a Ukrainian scuba diver based in Poland who they thought organized the sabotage, because the Russians didn't do it. They didn't realize who would do it. It was to cut off the gas from Russia to Germany, which was the major supply. Almost 49% of German industry and house use was coming from Nord Stream 1 and 2 that came from Russia. And so this has had a very shocking effect economically, but after these few years, the outcome is that the infrastructure has been built so natural gas comes from Norway, comes from the Middle East, comes from North America also, and so that sabotage did not really affect the economy as much as they thought it would actually help the green transformation and the infrastructure investment to wean Western Europe from the Russian petroleum and gas supplies. The other thing that's been happening is that ships like this have been carrying sanctioned oil out of Russian ports, going around the world selling it without, let's say, cooperation, insurance and things like that. So we see them out here coming and going. But worst of all is that they've had a couple of ships come and drop anchor and sever the communications cables. And as a professional sailor, no ship goes out and drags an anchor out in the middle of the sea. So it's done intentionally. We're not sure how, except that they have sent out the Coast Guard and and in the different nations, and now they watch all these ships very carefully. And Poland has a new law as of last month where if they see any ship that's tampering with pipelines or undersea cables, that's cause for direct intervention. So these countries, the Baltic trio, have been very nervous about the whole situation with the Russian border, and they've started to integrate and cooperate and join NATO, and then they're the most enthusiastic, let's say, opponents of any aggression in their neighborhood. Now, we'll be going to Finland and Sweden. I'll talk about that on another day, but these are the Baltic ministers coming to the White House and then to NATO meetings. And the formerly neutral Finland and neutral Sweden have also joined NATO, which provides a pretty common opposition to any actions that would be unwelcome by you-know-who. So I found this on a wall in Riga. And there was a Russian writer who recently wrote, "Don't ask when the war will end. That war does not exist at all. It's a special operation," in other words. "And it will never end, for Russia, our homeland, knows no boundaries." Well, that's sort of thinking like a real czar, I'd call it. And of course, we're safe, though, because we're ready for any invasion. He says it's not an invasion, it's a cruise. Well, anyway, this part of the world has been, let's say, squeezed between the eagle and the bear. And so one way or the other, these small countries have either been subjugated or else they've been independent and or, again, threatened. But I remember in my Russian studies, there's a proverb that says, "When you dance with the bear, it is the bear that decides when to stop." Well, we'll see. And then there's another story about a rabbit that runs across the Russian border into Poland. And another rabbit said, "What are you running for?" And the rabbit says, "Haven't you heard they're killing all the dogs in Russia?" And the rabbit said, "But you're not a dog." And the other one says, "I cannot prove that." So I found also some of these curious, what they call serio-comic maps of the situation in Europe going back to 1877. And you can look where maybe you live in one of these cartoons somewhere, but they keep evolving. So here's a German one with the alligator of Britain and the bulldog of Ireland, and that's Japan, by the way, the dragon. And again, the Russian menace is extravagantly illustrated, and of course Germany's just trying to defend itself from everybody. And then it goes on. This comes out occasionally in the cartoon world of, I like this Ronald Reagan and let's say Republicans and other real Americans, and Gorbachev and Thatcher and other characters. And here's the current model with the winds blowing from all directions. I think that's Trudeau, and that guy I've never seen before, and Maduro and various other, Xi Jinping and Kim Il-sung and others, and I guess that's the devil himself there, if you want to call it that. But anyway, this is not too entertaining, actually, to see this kind of repeating of history or rhyming of it. But now the Baltic Sea is right in the middle of this. I would say it's a territorial arrogance, the whole war, because there's not really any ideology involved in what is going on. There's no, I would say, the double coin of autocracy has been communism and fascism, and those are sort of tossed around, but there's no ideological battle. It's just about territory and feeling of entitlement. And so we're going to go now to Estonia, where we will be coming up into the Gulf of Finland. Helsinki's just right across the bay. St. Petersburg is just off the map to the right, not very far, a couple hundred kilometers. And Tallinn being the main port and capital of Estonia. And if you haven't been there, it's a particularly beautiful town. It is has a very well-preserved medieval core, and then a big city that sprawls out. We'll come in, and there's docking, and again, you can either walk into town or there's a shuttle bus that drops you off at the square. But Tallinn is definitely the transport and the government and the cultural center of small country again. There are a lot of these little islands where some of my friends say that they're the remnants of sort of the prehistoric peoples of this region who are still on the island, speak special dialects and have their own culture. But this again, Estonia had been conquered by the Danes back in 1219, and this is the famous painting of the Dannebrog battle, where the Danish cross, red flag, was said to fall from heaven and bless the king that came in with his bishop, saying, "You are ordained to run this part of the world." Well, it didn't last that long. Again, empires come and go. And then quite a bit later, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, the Estonians declared their independence. Then they had battles all across the country as part of the, let's say, the Russian Civil War, and then they were suddenly victorious in a certain place, and they had then regained their independence after all these centuries of being under others, let's say. But the town itself is very compact. There's a center here, we'll dock right near it. It spreads around. I once just got on a tram and went out to the suburbs, and the more farther you go, it gets more industrialized and with a lot of old Soviet military bases, actually. But the center of the town is this castle fortress right in the center. And again, we'll be docked right about there. They have a new building terminus for us all. But they have daily ferries to Stockholm and Helsinki. So it's a pretty busy place, and people commute because of the super fast ferries. And as you walk into town, there's some of the Soviet era buildings, some new glass towers, but this is the fortress compound, which is the center of the town. And as you come up the road, you come to some fortifications, and this is a memorial for the ferry Estonia. That accident happened a number of years ago. And then you come to the walls of the old town, which have been preserved. They had some action and some damage, but not much, and they've kept them in good shape. And this makes Tallinn one of the jewels of the Baltic, because it is pretty largely intact in the medieval quarters. And you walk through the gates and into sort of a shopping district, and then you can climb up pretty steep staircases, or if you're on a bus tour, they have a road around in the back to take you up to Klaipeda Castle. Now this dates from the 12th century, so parts of it are very old and medieval, and others are newer. It has a lot of little gardens and little alleyways, and so it's a great thing for kind of hiking around. And then when you get up to the top of the hill, and inside the fort, you have the National Assembly of the country, and this is done in St. Petersburg palatial style. And previously it had the emblem of Soviet Union and the Estonian Soviet Union or Republic. Now it's been replaced by the traditional symbol of the country. But just across the street from that National Assembly is the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, which is still a Russian Orthodox church, and it's open to the public. And there have been some Estonians say, well, we really should get rid of that church, but it's an architectural gem, and there are many Russian Orthodox faithful in the town of Tallinn, so they have not, let's say, returned the exclusion. But the other churches are Lutheran and come from the time when there was a big German trading community up here. But here's the Pahuvalmu Church, and then another one called the Tomkirk Cathedral. This one is noted because it has the tombs of the Knights of the Teutonic Order. And so you have these emblems from the Middle Ages of the various lands that these knights came from. Before there was a unified Germany, there were many places, Pomerania, Prussia, Frisia. You can, if you know the emblems, you can kind of read them. They have labels to tell you what they're, but these things are about 500 to 800 years old. And then there are modern tombs from the Napoleonic era and others. So it's a very interesting church to go into. Usually it is on the tour. But most people just walk around and enjoy the medieval town with these shop fronts and warehouses. There's one called the Pepper Sack, which has a restaurant. And the street is full of cafes and medieval actors and things like this. And then the beautiful doorways and sort of ancient, semi-medieval decorations on the houses. So some of them, of course, had residents in previous centuries, so there's often a memorial plaque, particularly for the writers and the musicians. If you know the music of the composer Part, he grew up in Tallinn, so his house is now preserved as a music museum. And then the rest of the town is sort of winding around in the medieval walls. You can go up the towers, walk along the wall, or just go into the old markets. Again, it has no cars in it, and it's a pedestrian maze as you get into it. Well, this is the town center, which is the center hall, the medieval Radhus, they call it Rekota, and it has a market around it which features a lot of the woolen goods. So if you're looking for something if you're somehow not warm enough on this summer cruise, you can get a nice woolen hat like this and beautiful sweaters and all that. I was going to stock up on Norwegian sweaters, but I postponed to get this stuff because it's quite colorful and fanciful. And so the view of the town hall has on its top what they call Old Thomas, who was the symbol of Tallinn, and he was said to be a young farm boy who excelled at climbing trees, and then he was a champion climbing Mayday poles and such. So he was said, if you can climb up and stay up on the top of the steeple of the city hall, that will guarantee our safety for the future. The real one from the 15th century is retired to a museum. This is a new one they put up recently because it had been hit by lightning, of course. But Old Thomas is here to greet you and hope that Tallinn and Estonia, along with the other Baltic countries, will be peaceful and prosperous and have good relations with its neighbors. So here's a view just going into from the castle to the new business district. And some of the trips will go out, and maybe you'll get to go see this, which is the world's largest choral theater. Every 5 years they have an international choral festival, and this is part of the singing revolution and the continuance of the culture, because they gather crowds up to 100,000 people who all sing in unison. And then when they don't have that particular musical event, they have international rock and roll and theater performances in it, but it's specially designed for the singing and kind of resonating out of the great art proscenium. So as they say in Estonian, the leaders speak and the leaders fall, but the song is not crushed. The song goes on. And I'll leave another last word to one Estonian Prime Minister, Kenneth Meri, who said, the Baltic area could be one region unified with Europe, but it would be a Europe in the barracks without our independence. It would be the opposite of the true Europe, and Europe's phenomenon to philosophical, intellectual, and economic values are founded on the circumstance that living side by side with large nations and small nations, they can defend their identity, because without identity you do not exist. And I'll leave the last word to my colleague, Captain James Kirk of the Starship Enterprise, who I apprenticed under, obviously. He said, the prejudices people feel about each other disappear when they get to know each other. And with that, I wish you a bon voyage in these states and enjoy your time in these countries. Thank you very much.